From the studios of KPFK Pacifica Radio in Los Angeles, this is Uprising, and I'm Sonali Kolhatkar. It's Friday, January 9th, 2015. The GOP kicks off its first week as the majority party in Congress, and a busy week it has been. We'll examine rule changes and new legislation tackling Social Security, Wall Street regulations, Obamacare, abortion, and the Keystone XL pipeline. And we'll speak with the authors of two scientific studies, one that links fracking to earthquakes, and another that determines exactly how much of our fossil fuel resources we need to keep unburned in order to survive as a species. That's coming up after the news. Joining us now to analyze today's headlines is Cristina Mislan. She is an assistant professor of journalism studies at the Missouri School of Journalism. Hi, Cristina.
Hello, Sonali.
Well, tensions are high in Paris as two standoffs between armed men and police are in progress. One is taking place just outside Paris and involves two brothers suspected of killing 12 people at the offices of the French magazine Charlie Hebdo on Wednesday morning. So far, no deaths have been reported, and it is not confirmed if the men are holding hostages. A second standoff, which may or may not be related to the Charlie Hebdo attack, is unfolding at a kosher grocery store in Paris, where a man named Ahmadi Koulibaly, suspected to have killed a police officer yesterday, is now apparently holding 5 people hostage and may have killed 2. French police have said that all 3 men are friends. Paris remains in crisis mode as police urge parts of the city to remain on lockdown. Meanwhile, the Saudi Arabian government today came under fire internationally for sentencing a human rights activist named Raif Badawi to 1,000 lashes for the crime of, quote, insulting Islam. France has close ties to Saudi Arabia, and the Saudi prince visited President Francois Hollande late last year to cement an arms deal. Well, how do you view what is unfolding in France, Cristina? Is it part of a broader global crisis?
Well, I think there might be a couple of issues here that we need to address. I think that the incident in Paris and in Saudi Arabia, but also even in incidents like with what's going on with Sony in North Korea, there's an interesting global conversation on the influence that media may or may not have on inciting violence. But I hate for this to turn into some sort of global conversation about the global crisis of like Islamic extremism, excuse me, or something like that.
A clash of civilizations narrative, if you will.
Exactly. I think what we really need to start looking at is not only the influence that media may have, but also governmental interests, right? And so the relationship here between France and Saudi Arabia is interesting to me. It seems like a contradiction, but then again, we have to understand that countries act according to their interests and not necessarily their principles.
Right. The Washington Post is reporting that the Nigerian militant group Boko Haram, quote, may have just killed 2,000 people. As part of its newly announced aspiration to create an Islamic caliphate, Boko Haram attacked the town of Baga in the northeastern state of Borno some days ago. The town had been under the protection of a number of African military forces. When the attack came from multiple sides, the soldiers apparently abandoned the town, leaving its residents to fend for themselves. At first it was thought hundreds of people were killed, but now media are reporting that as many as 2,000 may have been massacred. Boko Haram is considered even more brutal than the Islamic State militant group in Syria and northern Iraq. Neighboring Cameroon has appealed to the international community for help in stopping Boko Haram as it threatens to expand its operations across the border. Cristina, are you surprised at how little attention this story is getting?
Well, I think anyone who studies media understands that events get attention when there are interests at stake. And often media reflect their nation's larger political stances, especially international policies. And so we shouldn't be surprised that the story isn't getting attention. Now, if economic interests at some point become part of the story or something having to do with international politics and foreign policy, then maybe it will get more attention. But right now, African nations and thousands of people dying on the continent isn't important to some people.
And finally, a new video related to the Ohio police killing of 12-year-old Tamir Rice has been released. Cleveland city authorities have been pressured into making public the video of police actions in the minutes after Rice was gunned down by Officer Timothy Lohman. Rice's 14-year-old sister is seen in the video being tackled by police officers and pushed to the ground as she runs towards her fallen brother. The officers are seen handcuffing her and putting her into the back of their car. No one is seen attempting to offer the boy any medical help for many minutes until an FBI agent who happened to be in the area administered CPR. Rice died in the hospital the next day. The Rice family attorney Walter Madison called the treatment of Tamir's sister, quote, the cruelest thing I've ever seen on video. Christina, what does this video reveal to you about how police treat African Americans? I mean, these are two children that we're talking about here.
Right. Well, Sonali, it's absolutely horrendous. I think this video tells us the same story that all the other videos and accounts of police brutality tell us, that in this country, Black lives really don't matter, and that cops can basically continue to justify the murder of Black men regardless of age. We're talking both young Black men, older Black men. The age really does not matter at this point. But, you know, I think it's crucial, and this is really important, that the year 2015, that we continue to have this national conversation, and also to push the local and state and federal government to actually start taking a hard stance against police brutality, and we shouldn't accept any less.
Well, Cristina, I want to thank you as always for joining us, and we'll talk to you again next week.
Thank you.
Cristina Mislan is our daily Newsflash guest expert on Fridays. She is an assistant professor of journalism studies at the Missouri School of Journalism. When we come back, we'll take a look at week one of the Republican Party in the majority in both houses of Congress. They've been up to a lot. My guest, Dayen, will break it down. Stay tuned. Welcome back to Uprising. I'm Sonali Kolhatkar. As Republicans wrap up their first week in charge of both chambers of Congress, they seem to have wasted absolutely no time in unveiling their agenda. Cut benefits for poor, disabled Americans and lower taxes on the wealthy. In the House on Tuesday, GOP members passed a rule to stop the routine allocation of dollars from Social Security's old age fund to its disability fund. If it goes through, disabled Americans who receive disability benefits through Social Security would see a 20% cut. Meanwhile, the House and Senate introduced in rapid succession one bill after another. Two bills have been introduced to undermine the Affordable Care Act, one aimed at veterans and one at the hours required for workers to be considered full-time. A package of Wall Street giveaways was introduced but beaten, and two bills approving the Keystone pipeline and banning all abortions after 20 weeks have emerged. My guest is David Dayen, contributing writer at the Salon and a weekly columnist at Fiscal Times. Welcome to Uprising, David.
Thanks for having me.
So, very, very busy week.
Yeah.
It's been, day 4 now, really, technically, since the Congress was seated on Tuesday. Let's start with the Social Security story. So, currently a program within Social Security called Social Security Disability Insurance, or SSDI, shares funds between, that and the old age fund that people put into. And because the number of beneficiaries is increased, it needs more fund. And there's a routine sharing of funds that's apparently happened 11 times in the last few decades. Representative Tom Reed sponsored the rule change to bar the allocation. And he said he wants to, quote, force us to look for a long-term solution for SSDI rather than raiding Social Security to bail out a failing federal program. Retired taxpayers who have paid into the system for years deserve no less. So several things going on here. One, he's saying it's a failing federal program, and that it's raiding Social Security, even though it's really part of Social Security.
Yeah, this is a routine reallocation. As you said, it's happened 11 times in Congress. All the money is coming from the same place. It's coming from the routine allocation of money from everyone's paychecks to pay into Social Security. And so you have two buckets, basically, that it goes into, the disability fund and the old age fund. If you did the allocation, it would extend the life of the disability fund by 20 years while reducing the life of the old age fund by 1 year. So this is not that big a deal. The reason that there is a higher incidence of people getting money off the Social Security Disability Fund is the aging of the population. Older people generally are more inclined to be getting disability.
So Reid is apparently artificially pitting two groups against one another, but there's huge overlap. I mean, as people age, they're more likely to get disabled, for one thing.
Exactly. And as you said, the money comes from the same place. So when we're talking about this, we're talking about money that is sort of kind of artificially segmented. And reallocation is something that has been done. It was done in the 80s. It was last done in 1994. It's been done under Democratic presidents. It's been done under Republican presidents. It's been done in Democratic Congresses. It's been done in Republican Congresses. So this is highly unusual to sort of force a crisis here. Because if nothing is done, the disability fund will run out of the ability to pay full benefits in 2016, in next year.
So people, because of this simple rule change, which apparently Republicans, because they're in the majority in the House, have the authority to just do without having to worry about the president getting in their way. They can just do this, and it's a done deal now. And if nothing is changed, by 2016, people who are on SSDI could see a 20% cut in their benefits.
We'll see a 20%.
We'll see it.
I mean, there is nothing else that can be done if they're not allowed to replenish the disability fund with this reallocation of funds from the old age fund.
And all of these are monies coming from our paychecks for us.
Right. Right. And we have the ability, the money is there to extend the life of the fund by 17 years or 16 years. And that it's not being done it's really an artificial way to force a conversation about Social Security on Republican terms.
Right. So let's go to the other rule change that the Republicans just put in. This might require a little explanation. They have required in this first week that the Congressional Budget Office and others should change the way that they calculate fiscal projections. The GOP wants to use this obscure form of accounting called dynamic scoring, which, as I understand it, essentially makes serious assumptions about the economic stimulus benefits of tax cuts because they're laying the groundwork for cutting taxes on the wealthy. What is dynamic scoring?
Yeah, so the idea, it's not, it's an idea that you could see a reason for. The idea is that the Budget Office should take into account the economic benefit of a policy when they are setting up a budget score for it. In other words, if we put an infrastructure project together and that increases economic activity, then that should be accounted in. You're not just paying for the infrastructure, but you're getting the benefit of the economic activity, and that will increase revenue to the government through taxes if the economy does better. So that's the idea. Now, the way that the Republicans want to do it is this essentially have the idea that tax cuts pay for themselves. The problem with using dynamic scoring is that it's highly unpredictable. It's very hard to pinpoint whether or not a policy will have a specific economic effect. For example, in the tax reform policy that the Republicans put forward last year, the range of benefits was anywhere from no economic benefit to an economic benefit of 1.5% of GDP, gross
Which is
domestic product,
huge.
which is a huge range. And of course, Republicans, when they talked about the benefits of the policy, used the high end.
So this is like using a computer model, essentially,
Right.
tweaking a few assumptions and getting wildly different outcomes, and then picking the one that's most favorable to your political argument.
Exactly.
So if, now, of course, if we do account for things like the benefits of infrastructure, funding, education, et cetera, easing student debt, et cetera, if we do look at those broad things and look at their benefits, one can make an argument for dynamic scoring, but Republicans have cut off the kinds of economic activity that can be counted in dynamic scoring, so that it just tends to single out the tax cuts.
Right. I mean,
And we also know that when wealthy people get to keep more money, they aren't spending it necessarily. They're hoarding it.
True, true. I mean, there are some assumptions built into what the Republicans want the budget office to do. And a lot of this has to do with who they pick to run the Congressional Budget Office. You know, they've kicked out Doug Elmendorf, who was the previous head of CBO. And they're going to bring somebody in who could be a right-wing hack, who
will be a right-wing hack, right.
who ends up making this argument that tax cuts completely pay for themselves, and you can cut taxes to the bone, and it will have no effect on the Treasury whatsoever.
I should mention that many people have called this voodoo economics, and I think that's for obvious reasons. I mean, what's an extra $1 million for a billionaire at this point, right? Because
Right.
we're talking about an income gap that is so vast.
Right.
That Republicans just seem shameless in wanting to enrich fabulously wealthy people. Because they're just not wealthy enough, apparently.
Right. But there is, you know, this narrow pathway where you could see the White House in particular buying the argument of the need for some sort of tax reform that would be, you know, allegedly revenue neutral, would probably benefit businesses and the wealthy quite a bit. I was here on Election Day, and we talked
Yes.
about how there are these areas of congruence that are potential
Yeah.
between the White House and Republicans in Congress, and that's one of them. And getting a favorable CBO score, which, you know, I mean, one problem is that the CBO score has all of this importance, as if the only thing that the government should be doing is balancing its budget rather than, you know, providing services for its people that and improving their lives. So.
Yeah, and we know that the federal balancing of budgets is a favorite talking point for Republicans. So let's clarify what we've just talked about. Our rule changes, they're a done deal. The Republicans can just do this because they're the majority party in office. Other things that they want to do have to go through the normal legislative process, and they have introduced a number of bills, and they will likely introduce, of course, bills on tax cuts and Social Security based on these rule changes we just talked about. They're just laying the groundwork right now.
Absolutely.
But what they already introduced, let's talk about the Affordable Care Act. On Tuesday, their first day, they introduced a bill exempting veterans from the employer mandate of the law, essentially saying that veterans have the VA to rely on, that they shouldn't have to worry about getting health insurance through their employer.
I suppose so. I mean, the entire idea is to sort of chip away
Yeah.
at the Affordable Care Act, and of course, you know, veterans is sort of this catch-all phrase that, oh, we don't want to impede the ability of veterans to operate in any way, and so, you know, they're a comfortable shibboleth that you can sort of throw on in order to achieve this chipping away.
And then the next bill that they threw out just 2 days later is a bill reducing the number of hours that a worker must be considered full-time from 30 hours to 40 hours in order to get health insurance. So what I understand is that essentially Republicans are saying that if a worker is considered full-time at a minimum of 30 hours a week, this would incentivize employers to cut their hours so that they don't have to
Right.
provide health care.
Right.
So, but by expanding the definition of full-time to 40 hours a week, which is what most people work
Right.
who are full-time, then all an employer has to do is reduce, say, 1 hour and say, oh, you're
Exactly.
working 39 hours a week. Now we can't give you health care. Haven't they actually made it easier for employers to not give health care?
They've made it far easier, and that this is a complete giveaway to businesses. I mean, the idea, as you say, there are far many people working 40 hours a week or 41 than there are working 30 or 31. So it's just easier for businesses to cut hours just slightly at the 40-hour mark and then get exempt essentially from the employer mandate and the ability, the need for them to provide health care to their workers. So yes, this is a complete giveaway to basically undermine the employer mandate provision.
Right. And I should say, of course, these are bills that have been introduced. They would have to go through the entire legislative process and
right.
then
and
land at the White House's desk.
The president has said on at least the 40-hour bill that they would veto the bill. So you would need a 2/3 vote to override that, and it's not likely that they have that.
Right. So just to clarify then, the Republicans, if they want to get through any bill and override the president's veto, any bill needs a 2/3 majority in both houses in order to bypass the president's veto. On some issues, they could get that.
Right, but here's the crucial point. The crucial point is that there's a lot of must-pass legislation that comes up in the course of Congress. Whether it's a budget bill or whether it's the debt ceiling, which is coming up to once again in the summer, or there are a number of these must-pass vehicles, deadlines that Congress has. And the way in which they did this in the end of last year with the budget bill, they called it the Cromnibus, the year-end budget bill, is they threw in a bunch of policy riders that could not get support on their own. But if they're attached to a must-pass vehicle that has other things the White House wants, they may acquiesce to chips away here and there.
Right.
So that is the blueprint.
So they're sneaking stuff in that they want into must-pass bills.
Right.
Yeah.
So they might introduce them now and just sort of gauge the support.
Yeah.
But the real idea is to tee them up for later when they have these bills that have to pass, and then they will attach these like barnacles to a ship and sail it along.
Nice analogy.
Yeah.
So you wrote about one small victory that took place this week. You wrote about it in The Guardian. Republicans introduced this very bizarre sounding a bill called the Promoting Job Creation and Reducing Small Business Burdens Act this week as well.
Who can be against that?
Exactly.
It's
Orwell couldn't have written a better title for this bill. What did this bill do? How is it that Democrats actually managed to beat it back, and what does it bode for the future?
Right. It was actually a collection of 11 bills that were introduced in the last Congress, and all of them deregulate Wall Street in one way or another. It has nothing to do with small businesses or supporting jobs or whatever. It's about exempting various corporations or major financial institutions from mandates that are in the Dodd-Frank bill or mandates that are put on by the SEC or things like that. And also it would delay a key element of the Volcker Rule, which was one of the biggest parts of Dodd-Frank, by an additional 2 years, so that big banks would not have to get rid of these very risky trades called CLOs until 2019. Right now they have until 2017 because the Federal Reserve already delayed this for 3 years.
Right.
So it would add an additional 2 years. Now the reason that Democrats were actually able to beat this back is that they brought this up under something called suspension of the rules. If they don't have to go through regular order, the House in Congress, they can bring something out through suspension of the rules. They need a 2/3 vote, which means they needed 40-odd Democrats to go along with this. And Democrats, particularly sort of the Wall Street Democrats, have gone along with this in the past. The difference is now is that the Financial Reform Coalition, the Elizabeth Warren wing of the party, knows that all they have to do is sort of publicize these bills to make, bring them into the cold light of day. And Democrats, Wall Street Democrats, will run scurrying away from them because they don't want to be seen as giving handouts to the financial industry. And that's what happened, this was sort of blown up in significance over a course of a couple days, and enough Democrats were held back from voting for it that they were not able to get a 2/3 vote under suspension of the rules. Right. But once again, this is something that will be brought up later. First of all, Republicans have already said they're going to bring it up under regular order and pass it in the House.
Because they beat it back on a technicality right now.
Essentially, yeah, because of the 2/3 vote.
Yeah.
So under a majority vote, this will easily pass.
Right.
And it will be teed up for, these must-pass bills later on. We have this. It had bipartisan support. It got, a couple dozen Democrats to agree with it. And, just put this along with a budget bill or something like that, and we can get this done.
Right. So this is a package of bills that essentially is attempting to chip away at the only major piece of financial regulation that has passed since the Great
crisis,
Recession.
yeah. Mm-hmm.
and already considered not strong enough by progressives.
No.
So let's talk about the Keystone XL pipeline, which is the other major battle that Republicans are gearing up for. Big news today on the Keystone XL pipeline. One, that the Senate Energy Committee approved a bill that Republicans introduced, and the Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell wants to fast track this, essentially. But the other piece of news related to Keystone outside of the halls of Congress was that in Nebraska, the state of Nebraska, which the Keystone XL pipeline, the proposed pipeline, would cut through, there had been a legal obstacle to it because of a court that said that essentially it was unconstitutional to get this pipeline to cut it, and a new court ruling just this morning overturned that. So it looks as though all these political obstacles are falling away one by one. President Obama has already announced formally that he would veto a Keystone approval.
Right.
Could they still get it passed?
I mean, that's the biggest political obstacle, is that you will need, once again, a two-thirds vote to override. Last year, Democrats, in a bizarre attempt to try to save the political career of Mary Landrieu, who ended up losing by 20 points, they brought up a vote on the Keystone XL pipeline. It got 59 votes. And based on who got back into Congress and who came out and where everybody voted, you can see about 63 votes in the Senate for Keystone XL. That's not enough. That's less than 67 that you would need.
But it's close.
To override the veto. But it's close. And you could see this gambit, as I've talked about, of, okay, we have this debt ceiling bill. You want to pass a debt ceiling, you have to approve the Keystone XL pipeline. This is the gambit. This is the way that these things are going to get passed. And, Democrats have to pay attention to it.
Right. And then Senator Lindsey Graham, of course, can be counted on to chip away at women's rights. Did so this week without much, without wasting much time, introducing a bill to ban all abortions nationwide after 20 weeks of gestation. Another horribly named bill. This one is called the Pain-Capable Unborn Child Protection Act, similar to one that had been introduced into the House earlier. I mean, this sounds like a joke.
And we've seen this in the states too. I mean, several states, I believe, have passed these 20-week bills. And the idea there is to really provoke a fight in the Supreme Court, and to push these laws up the chain of litigation to actually get a Supreme Court ruling, because I believe pro-life conservatives think that they now have a majority on the court to chip away at Roe v. Wade.
Do they?
They may, particularly on, I don't know on 20 weeks, but on many other policies, it's certainly possible. And of course, as we've seen in the states, literally hundreds of anti-abortion bills have been passed, and there's severe restrictions on access to medical centers and medical attention for women who want to make their own choices about medical decisions.
Right. So just to kind of recap, it seems as though the real worry with the Republican agenda is not whether we can count on Obama to veto bills, but whether they're going to play such hardball with must-pass bills that they're going to set up these huge fights in Congress, forcing the president and the Democrats' hands on really big issues, just so we can get very basic things done, like funding the government, like increasing the debt ceiling. Could we see major standstills in government this year, as we have done in the past, as we've seen during Obama's tenure in the past?
It's certainly possible, and it's really up to the White House. I mean,
is it up to the White House?
It is. Last year, at this year-end budget bill, they accepted a lot of these right-wing whiners. That was not a good bill that passed. And
did he
really
have an option to stand
and
for?
And all it did on the other side was fund the government. So, I mean, there are options of the White House standing as strong as the Republicans are and provoking a fight. I mean, the fight over that led to the government shutdown of 2013, I think, ended up playing in the White House's favor to a certain extent. The fact that the economy is sort of humming along, we had a decent jobs number today, oil prices are way down, consumer confidence is up, that could tend to help the White House in terms of these fights, because they can say, look, we have a good economy going. We don't want to screw it up. All you're doing by provoking trying to hold these bills hostage is to break down the progress that we're making. So that is a possibility. Now, the other possibility is for a lot of horse trading between the White House and the Republican Party on things that either they're not objectionable in the eyes of the president and his economic team, or things that they see as an acceptable loss.
Right.
And that's really going to be the idea here. So I think the role of Democrats in Congress is to say to the White House, look, you have to stand strong on these ideas.
And I should mention, speaking of the economy, big news from the White House this week is President Obama's plan to make community college free or nearly free for people around the country. And the other big news that I'd like to end on then is Senator Barbara Boxer in California announcing her retirement yesterday, where she will not run for senator in 2016. Now, Boxer's been an institution in California for many years. Just her announcement that she's not going to be running has already set off a media frenzy to figure out what we'll see in terms of the scramble to replace her. Do Republicans feel like they have any chance at a Senate seat in California?
No. I mean, what this is about a changing of the guard within the Democratic Party. I mean, you have 3 seats, Boxer's, who she's retiring, Jerry Brown, who's termed out, and he'll be something like 80 years old, and Dayen Feinstein, who's over 80 and probably will retire in 2018. And you're going to have another generation of Democrats coming into these seats, and we'll have to see who they are.
Is there any tiny chance that some major progressive leader might throw their hat in the ring and California could see a really, progressive on all fronts senator?
I'm very hopeful for a progressive like Jackie Spear that she gets in the race. The main talk has been talked about, Gavin Newsom,
Right.
Kamala Harris, people like that. Tom Steyer, who's just a guy with a lot of money. He's very progressive on environmental policy, but we know nothing else about his views. I think Jackie Spear would be great, and so let me use this opportunity to say, Jackie, if you're out there, go for it.
All right. Well, thank you so much, David Dayen, for joining us today. And we'll link to your writing from our website, uprisingwithsonali.com, later today. Thanks so much.
Okay. Thanks for having me.
David Dayen is a columnist at the Fiscal Times and a contributing writer at Salon. This is Uprising. When we come back, we'll talk to scientists involved in a couple of studies linked to fossil fuels and oil consumption. Stay tuned. Welcome back to Uprising. I'm Sonali Kolhatkar. A new study in Ohio has found evidence of earthquake activity resulting from hydraulic fracturing or fracking operations. Seismologists examined data from a magnitude 3.0 earthquake in Poland Township, Ohio last March, which took place less than a mile from a fracking operation run by Hillcorp Energy. The seismic activity is thought to have occurred due to an existing but previously unknown fault in the rock layer being stimulated by fracking. Scientists identified dozens of other smaller earthquakes that were too small to be felt by humans. The study has implications for states like California, where fracking operations are expanding rapidly and where seismic activity is the norm. The fracking industry has long insisted that its operations do not trigger earthquakes that can be felt. Michael Brudzinski is a professor of seismology in the Department of Geology and Environmental Earth Sciences at Miami University in Ohio. The paper he has co-authored is entitled Earthquakes Induced by Hydraulic Fracturing in Poland Township, Ohio. It was published this week in the Bulletin of the Seismological Society of America. Welcome, Mike.
Hi, nice to be with you.
Thanks so much for joining us. Well, first let's talk about the specific situation in Poland Township, Ohio. This is an area where there is very little seismic activity normally, although, of course, there are faults in the plates below the surface of the Earth. How did you determine that the 3.0 magnitude earthquake was linked to a fracking operation?
Well, this is based on nearly all the earthquakes that we found occurring when the fracking was closer than about a half mile to a fault in that deeper, older rock. So there were nearly 100 other episodes of fracking that were slightly further away, but they didn't induce earthquakes. So it was just during the time frames, which could have been, only a couple of hours when some of these episodes were taking place. Only the ones that were closest were when we were seeing the earthquakes occur.
And so you
yeah,
made an assumption that this earthquake would have to be related to the fracking operation?
Right, so it's very hard to explain why these earthquakes would be concentrated during several hour periods, right when the fracking operations were taking place, other than that the fracking nearby, again, in this case, less than a half mile away from where the earthquakes are occurring. It would be very hard to explain that from a natural kind of phenomenon.
So then this afforded scientists like you the opportunity to study the signature, I suppose it is, of an earthquake, the seismic signature of an earthquake, to see if you can then use that to identify other seismic activity linked to fracking. Is that accurate?
Yeah, so we like to refer to our technique as like an earthquake fingerprint scan, where similar to what you might see on TV, where they take a fingerprint of interest and they scan it through like on NCIS. We're trying to do that with the seismic data. So we'll take an earthquake that we're interested in. We then want to see, are there other similar earthquakes to that? It's common, particularly in places like Ohio that don't have a lot of earthquakes, that you'd have only a handful of earthquakes that would happen, and they wouldn't have many other earthquakes similar to that. But in these cases where it's induced, you'll see that the earthquakes repeat in swarms because there's sort of a forcing that's going on because of the operations. And so when we performed that in this case, we turned a couple of earthquakes into 77 earthquakes that all had these sort of similar pattern that were coming from a very localized region in the area.
When you say you turned a couple of earthquakes into 77, what you're saying is that there are small earthquakes that are so small that we don't feel them, that we know happen from fracking operations, and you were able to identify those.
That's right, yeah, and so I would distinguish just a little bit that there are fractures that happen with any kind of fracking operation, right? That they're fracturing the rock to generate pores, that spaces where the gas and oil can be harvested from. In this case, we were seeing earthquakes that are a little different than that. They're not fracturing, they are a fault slip. And so they are still very small. So I agree with you 100% that what our technique is doing is just trying to find those smaller earthquakes that are down, buried in the noise, harder to see with our regular techniques. And so the technique we developed is just trying to extract out those smaller earthquakes. The main point just being, if we have more earthquakes that we can see, we can then better understand what is causing them.
So explain for our audience how it works. I mean, there are existing faults below the Earth's surface, basically a sort of discontinuity in the rock. And when high-pressure liquids are injected below the surface of the Earth, as a fracking operation does, it stimulates these faults, but it doesn't actually create faults, right?
Well, so they are actually trying to create fractures in the target layer that has sort of the gas and oil trapped in it. So they're trying to sort of open up pores there for that material to come out. But they, very rarely do we see any cases where other sorts of earthquakes are being produced. And so, the case that we're seeing here, where we're seeing, up to a magnitude 3 earthquake, we don't think that magnitude 3 earthquake is a new fault being generated, that the rock layer that those earthquakes are happening in is a very old and faulted layer of the Earth that's below the sort of sedimentary rocks that have been laid down over millions of years. And so it's common to see earthquakes sort of in that sort of deeper layer. It just appears in this case that the fracking operation sort of pushed it a little bit to slip at this time when the fracking was taking place.
And so this was a fault that wasn't previously known, and because this earthquake that was felt, I assume it then enabled people to go and check and realize that there was this fault that just hadn't been mapped before. So we don't really know. It could be that any place where there are fracking operations, there could be unmapped faults that could then get triggered into earthquakes that can be felt by us.
Right, and so this is an important point. So, again, I should start with just the general background that there are tens of thousands of fracking operations around the world, and we very rarely see earthquakes like this. But it does appear that when they happen, there are these sort of faults that they happen to go nearby that then get triggered. And so, it's important to point out also that, this is not sort of lack of due diligence by the companies, that these kinds of faults that in the case that we're seeing here are primarily moving horizontally, right? So we're not talking about faults that move vertically. Those would be a lot easier to see in the scans that they typically do before they do their drilling. These kind of horizontal motion faults, those would be much harder to see in those scans. And so it doesn't seem unusual to us that people would not have recognized a fault like this beforehand. And so we're really advocating with a study like this that what we just need is new technology, like we're sort of demonstrating with this study, that can help identify these faults on the fly, right? That if you're sort of scanning for earthquakes while the operations are taking place, you can recognize when an earthquake is happening and see whether or not there's a series of them that we can then try and identify where that fault is and avoid it with the ongoing operations.
I am assuming that within our audience there are many people who oppose entirely the practice of fracking for a whole host of other reasons, such as climate change, groundwater pollution, etc. But let's also talk about the fact that there's a fracking activity which itself injects water mixed with chemicals at high pressure into the Earth's surface. That's why it's called hydraulic fracturing. And then there's the disposal of wastewater, which the oil and gas industry essentially injects, I understand, deep into the earth to dispose of. Is that also something that can trigger seismic activity?
It is, and in fact, this is an important point that the scientific community is more concerned about this wastewater injection, that it does appear that we are seeing more earthquakes associated with the wastewater injection than from the fracking process itself. And so when I say, fracking rarely causes earthquakes, that's, during the fracking process. But this leftover wastewater following the fracking activity that needs to be injected down even below where the fracking interval is. And that's why many people would argue that this injection process, is designed to avoid contaminating aquifers and drinking water. But it does appear that by injecting it quite deep, it runs the risk of helping to get into and open up faults that are deep within these rock layers. And so the process there is, if the water can get in to these deep faults and sort of open up some space between the two sides of the fault, that makes it easier for the fault to move. And so that's why it does appear that this wastewater injection can produce earthquakes at a sort of higher rate than the fracking rate itself. And another part that we're a little concerned about is the size, that there's been a recent study that suggests that perhaps the amount of water injected is related to the size of the earthquake that you could get. So the more that we inject in a particular region, that raises the risk of larger earthquakes. And so we have seen some magnitude 4 and 5 size events in Ohio and places like Oklahoma that have generated some damage. So I would say, the scientific community is more concerned about this aspect of fracking than the earthquakes occurring during the fracking process.
Well, finally, let me ask you, Mike, about the way in which your study specifically could be used. And this is with respect to earthquakes that could be triggered directly from the fracking operations. Could your study be used in a place like California, where there's known seismic activity, to be able to distinguish an earthquake that happened naturally versus an earthquake that happened as a result of fracking because of this fingerprint that you have tried to identify?
Absolutely. I would certainly advocate that this is a technology that can help in places where there is sort of background seismicity at higher levels. And the idea is just, again, this aspect of swarminess is a term we might use, that, whether or not, during the operations, you're seeing a whole set of earthquakes that are happening during very particular operations, over a short couple-hour period. If you see a big flurry of events during those times, that suggests this is, a set of earthquakes that are being triggered by the process, as opposed to just sort of happening in the background, And so, again, this fingerprinting, I think, really could help to sort of distinguish between these two sets of earthquakes.
I want to thank you so much, Michael Brudzinski, for joining us today and sharing your research with us.
I appreciate the opportunity to talk about it. Thank you.
Thank you. Michael Brudzinski is a professor of seismology in the Department of Geology and Environmental Earth Science at Miami University in Ohio. Just co-authored a paper entitled Earthquakes Induced by Hydraulic Fracturing in Poland Township, Ohio. This is Uprising. When we come back, we'll speak with another scientist about another study related to climate change. He has determined exactly how much of what kind of fossil fuel can be burned and how much must be left unburned if we are to survive as a species. Stay tuned. Welcome back to Uprising. I'm Sonali Kolhatkar. Before we go to our last story of the day, I want to announce breaking news as this program is happening. We have just heard that two suspects who are wanted in the shooting deaths of 12 people at the offices of Charlie Hebdo in Paris on Wednesday have apparently just been killed by French police. The two brothers, Sharif Kouachi, 32 years old, and his brother Saeed, 34, had been cornered in a printing warehouse in Paris and were killed in an operation to free what might have been hostages that they were keeping. We will, of course, be covering this on our program on Monday. We turn now to another scientific study, also related to the oil and gas industry. It's a well-established scientific fact now that the planet can only afford 2 degrees Celsius of warming in order to allow humanity to survive on its surface. What has not really been known until now is which heat-inducing fossil fuels can we afford to burn and which we must leave in the ground in order for species survival. Oil and gas companies have large inventories of fossil fuels in the form of coal, gas, and oil. They also have large and expensive operations to extract fuel from hard-to-reach sources like tar sands in Canada, deep-sea drilling operations, and Arctic resources. A new study conducted at University College London has found that for some industries like coal, a majority of reserves actually need to be left underground. Tar sands cannot really be touched at all. Even for natural gas, which has seen a boom from hydraulic fracking operations, only about half of all reserves can be burned. We go now live to London to speak with the author of the study, Christophe McGlade. He's a research associate at Bartlett School of Environment, Energy and Resources at University College London. Hi, Christophe. Now, how did you identify which industries would be impacted? Did you make assumptions about which fossil fuels would have to be used first based on availability and cost?
Yeah, so the method we used for this was to use an energy system model. This is a very detailed representation of how the world may well use energy in the future. And we model things like how much heat will people require in the world, how will they drive their cars in the future, and then mapped up the different energy sources which can be used to provide those energy services, and also the technologies that can be used for that. And once you've done that, you can then look at, well, where are the fossil fuels used that are required if we want to keep at 2 degrees, and where are those that aren't used?
So let's also talk about what forms of fossil fuels you consider. There's coal, there's oil, there's gas. What else?
So there's also all of the renewable sources. There's nuclear energy and bioenergy as well.
So what are the, how do we know in terms of the existing inventories of fuel and of unextracted fuels that companies and governments may or may not have concrete plans to extract and use? We know that there are companies that have plans, but do you make assumptions about how many fossil fuels are in the ground?
Certainly. So the distinctions that are normally made are between reserves and resources. Reserves are those estimates which we think are currently extractable with current economic and technology, and which have a good probability of being produced. So that's what you could consider is likely to be produced in the future. On the other hand, you've got the resource base, which is a much, much bigger number for the most part, and that includes any technologies which haven't actually been brought through yet, and also that ignores any economic conditions. So it's important to distinguish between reserves and resources in that respect.
Right. So tell us, give our listeners and our viewers some numbers. Coal, I understand, is pretty heavily impacted. And is that because it's such a dirty fuel, or that there's just so much of it available and cheap to produce, or both?
Well, it's a bit of both. So yes, the headline figures from the study are that around 80% of current coal reserves are unburnable if we want to have a good chance of staying below 2 degrees, around half of current gas reserves, and about a third of oil reserves.
And then how does your study also actually interestingly looked at which countries and their industries would be impacted the most? So I understand U.S. coal and Canadian tar sands, for example, are areas that you specifically identify?
They are, yes. So this is one of the new aspects of this study. We looked at the individual regions and how the fossil fuel reserves within each of these are likely to be impacted. And yes, as you say, the coal reserves within the United States, there's only around 10%, less than 10% of coal reserves can be developed in the United States. Similarly, for the tar sands or the oil sands in Canada, around 85% of them can't be developed. But it's also important to remember that there's other countries as well around the world. The Middle East, for example, we estimated that around 260 billion barrels of oil has to remain in the ground for it to stay within its 2 degree threshold. That's a lot of oil. That's approximately the current oil reserves of Saudi Arabia.
Now, there are climate denialists who say that there is no such thing as global warming. Then there are climate pragmatists who say, yes, it's warming, but we're just going to come up with a technology to fix it. One such technology is so-called carbon capture and sequestration. Did your study account for that? And if so, did it make any difference?
Well, this is one of the surprising aspects of the study was that carbon capture and storage is often made out to have a bit of a magic bullet. It'll allow us to produce all of the current fossil fuel reserves. But actually, that's not really what we showed. That had a much more modest impact than potentially many companies and many people are hoping that it might have.
And so does that then bode ill for this idea that a technological fix will save us? I mean, your study is essentially looking at conservation. You know, it's implying that we cannot afford to that we must find other ways, other means of energy. If we want to survive as a species, we just simply have to leave huge percentages of fossil fuels unburned.
Indeed, and one of the things that really comes out of this study is that all policymakers around the world, when all countries have agreed to keep temperature rises below this 2 degree threshold, and at the same time, nearly all politicians around the world want to develop the fossil fuels that they have within their own countries. And what we show is that these two aspects are really mutually exclusive. They're inconsistent policy positions to have. And whenever you have some tangible figures like we provide in this study, it really drills that message home.
And so there is, are you able to estimate what the warming level would be if governments and corporations involved in the energy sector are able to fulfill their wildest dreams and essentially extract and burn all the fossil fuels that they have plans for? How much will the Earth warm?
So the carbon budget, as they call it, for 2 degrees is around 1,100 gigatons from now onwards, and the carbon embodied in all current estimates of fossil fuels is around 3,000 gigatons. So that's around 3 times. And if all of that's emitted completely unsequestered, then it's likely that we'll be heading towards around a 4 degrees warming by the end of the century. It's important to note, however, that 4 degrees assumes that there's none of these positive feedback loops which people often talk about. Once you reach a certain temperature rise, it's increasingly likely that you might hit a trigger point, which means that you get completely runaway climate change, and you're not able to keep the temperatures to a reasonable level.
Right. So as it gets warmer, things that we couldn't necessarily predict beforehand could trigger even more warming, which is the whole concept of this runaway climate change. So it's one thing to say that if we burn all our reserves and keep extracting as we're extracting, that we won't survive as a species. It's another thing for this projection to actually be taken seriously by the powers that be. Later this year, there's going to be a major climate conference. The United Nations is holding in Paris. And I'm wondering what the odds are that your study will actually be taken seriously. You've provided very specific numbers for very specific industries and very specific countries. Do you hope that your study will actually be used?
Well, what we hope is that it can feed into the conversation that they are likely to have in Paris. You would anticipate that countries which are going to have to leave a lot of their fossil fuels in the ground are going to have to be compensated for that. And that is an important aspect to consider whenever the policymakers are talking about keeping the temperature rise to 2 degrees. So indeed, hopefully they will take this study seriously and they will dwell on it.
We just earlier in our program been talking about a drive by the Republican Party in the U.S. to push forward the Keystone XL pipeline that would pipe Canadian tar sands across the United States and to be processed in our Gulf states here. But your study is essentially saying 85% of Canadian tar sands really can't be used if we want to survive.
Yes, and to put a few more specific numbers on that, the current production of oil sands in Alberta is around 2 million barrels a day, and the companies there and the regulators are hoping that will increase to around 4 million barrels a day by around 2040. But what our study shows is actually there needs to be a stagnation for the next 10 years before a slow decline in the amount of oil sands that are produced. So the risk is, and we don't specifically mention Keystone XL in the paper, but it's an important aspect that comes through is a risk is that Keystone could become a stranded asset. It could be after it's constructed, if politicians then agree to the 2 degrees temperature rise, there might not be any oil sands to put through it, and it's a waste of money.
And I mean, I appreciate you saying if politicians agree to the 2-degree rise, but I mean, it's really not a choice. We kind of have to stick to 2 degrees if we want to survive. We are already seeing the impacts of climate change here in the United States, extreme weather. Every year it seems to be more extreme, consistent with predictions of climate change. Finally, can you tell us also how poor countries could, major countries like China and Brazil that do rely on economic stimulation from using their fossil fuels are also going to have to take this seriously. And these sorts of things turn into political questions. But of course, you, as a scientist, use some very basic determinants to figure out which industries must hold back and which ones can afford to just burn a little bit.
Yes, so if we take the Chinese example there, they are a very heavily coal-based economy and have a huge amount of coal use in their energy system. And it's likely that the study would suggest that they can use more of their coal reserves than, for example, the United States. It's easier for the United States to diversify to alternative sources and to low-carbon sources than it would be for China. However, China is still going to have to leave an awful lot of coal in the ground. Just to put a number on that, in the study we combine China and India together, and they need to leave around 200 billion tons of coal in the ground. That's around a fifth of current coal reserves globally. So all countries have to make some sacrifices if we're to have a reasonable chance of staying below 2 degrees.
And of surviving. I want to thank you so much for joining us. And, when I say the planet will survive. It's us as a species that we have to worry about. Thank you so much, Christophe, for joining us.
Thank you.
Christophe McGlade is my guest. He's a research associate at Bartlett School of Environment, Energy and Resources at University College London. This is Uprising. Bipasha Shom is our senior producer. Anna Buss is our assistant producer. Alexander Hobbs is our technical director. Christian Beck is our production assistant. Federico Garcia and Jonathan Alexander are our audio engineers. You can subscribe to our YouTube channel at youtube.com/Uprising with Sonali. Our website is uprisingwithsonali.com. Our theme music is by Quetzal. I'm Sonali Kolhatkar, host and executive producer of Uprising. Have a wonderful weekend. I'll see you on Monday.